Well, hello everybody. Here we are back again with Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. And if you recall clear back at the very beginning, I mentioned something about how many connections there are between something in the book with something else in the book. Have you noticed any of those? Keep an ear open for some aha moments that will happen quite a bit in the rest of the book. We're that far into it. A little more than half to go. And so things are going to all come back to those. You're just going to have a string of, oh, things. So pay attention to those and hopefully you'll find them. Hopefully they make sense for you. And go ahead and, when something happens, go ahead and shout, oh, or write it on a comment or something like that if you can do that. I don't even know if you can. But anyway, here we are at chapter 21. Minley and the Buffalo Boy pushed through the crowd as the sun burned the tops of their heads. You remember that they're on the way to the Market of Green Abundance to maybe see the king. Minley used to spare harvests. Minley used to spare harvests in her village, couldn't help gaping at the tall mounds of food for sale at the Market of Green Abundance. The street and open courtyard were filled with umbrella-covered stands and stalls, flaunting jade-colored cabbages and curled cucumbers, purple eggplants and tangy oranges. Glossy, sugared hawthorn berries like rubies on a stick made Minley's mouth water. "I don't see the king anywhere," Minley said. "Well, maybe he's not here yet," the Buffalo Boy said. "I don't know if I'll find him here," Minley said. Now in the daylight, the Buffalo Boy's friend didn't seem as extraordinary. What would the king be doing at a street market anyway? "Well, she said that he'd be here, so he will," the Buffalo Boy said, his mouth making a stubborn line. "Hey, get away from that," a vendor yelled as the buffalo attempted to eat frosty green lettuce. The Buffalo Boy quietly pulled him away. "Get your buffalo out of here," the vendor shouted, as red-faced as the radishes that he was selling. "I'd better take him away," the Buffalo Boy said, pulling the buffalo's head away from the arrays of tempting food. "He's hungry and I should take him out to pasture." "Well, I'll stay right here," Minley said. "You don't need to look for the king with me." "Okay," the boy said. "If you need a place to stay tonight, you know where my hut is. If not, maybe I'll see you around. Good luck." "Thanks," Minley said. But as he carelessly waved goodbye, she realized that she might not see him again. And before he disappeared from sight, she grabbed the last coin out of her bag and ran to him. "Wait," Minley said. "Here, take this." "Oh, no," the boy laughed. "I don't need that. You keep it." "But," Minley started, but he had already turned around. "Goodbye," he heard her call, or she heard him call, and the buffalo snorted a farewell as well. Minley smiled wryly to herself. Now what? Minley thought as she wandered past stalls, weaving around merchants and customers. How am I supposed to find the king here? "Please spare a piece of fruit for an old man," a voice cracked, and Minley turned around and saw a wrinkled poor man begging at a peach stand. He was dirty and bent, and his clothes looked like they'd been made from rags used to wash the floor. "Please," he begged the peach vendor, "I'm so thirsty. One small peach, your smallest." "Go away, old man," the fat vendor said. "No money, no peach." "Oh, please," the beggar said again weakly. "Pity a tired old man." "Get away from here, you worthless beggar," the vendor spat out, "or I'll call the guards on you." The vendor's loud voice had attracted attention to passers-by, and a small crowd began to form in front of the peach stand. "It's disgraceful to treat an old man like that," someone murmured. "Just give him a peach." "Oh, all of you are so generous with my property," the vendor glared at the crowd. "If you care so much, you buy him a peach." As Min Li watched the beggar's hand outstretched and shaking with hunger, she felt a sharp pang inside her. It reminded her of Ba reaching out with his last chopsticks of rice for her fish. The copper coin that she had offered to the buffalo boy was warm in her hand. She could almost feel her heart beating against its round edges. "Here," she said, handing the coin to the vendor. Then she picked the largest peach from the stand and handed it to the old man. He bowed to her gratefully and eagerly ate the peach. Forgetting about the inner city and the palace, for a moment Min Li watched him. In fact, as if under a spell, the whole crowd stood and watched him swallow the fruit until he held a peach pit in his hand. "Thank you," the beggar said in a much stronger voice, and he bowed to the onlooking people. "The peach was so delicious, I wish for all of you to be able to taste it. If you would humor an old man and stay a while, I'll share my good fortune." The old man took a small stick out of his pocket and bent down. In the dirt next to the black bricks, he dug a small hole and planted his peach pit. He stuck his stick upright into the little mound and then asked for water. Min Li, now completely fascinated, took out her water jug and handed it to him. As he poured water onto the stick, it trembled, and was she imagining it? It seemed to grow. And it was growing. The stick grew higher and higher and thicker until it was the width of Min Li's arm. When she could no longer see the top of it, pink flowers and branches began to blossom out of it. As the sweet scent of the flowers filled the air, Min Li realized that the stick had become a peach tree. The crowd of people seemed to realize this too, and they all gaped at it, open-mouthed. Even the stingy vendor left his fruit stand to stare at it in awe. Like pink snow, the petals fell from the tree and made a soft carpet on the dirt. Green leaves sprouted, and they cascaded over the branches. Pale, moon-colored balls like pearls developed, almost as if they were small balloons being blown with air. They soon grew into round fruit, blushing pink and red as they developed. Soon the tree was heavy with them, and the air was full of the enchanting smell of ripe peaches. Children gathered around and stared longingly at the luscious fruit, while the adults gulped with their mouths watering. And finally the old man reached up, plucked a peach from the tree, and handed it to one of the people in the crowd. "Please," he said, waving his hand, "help yourself." The crowd needed no more urging. Young children climbed the tree and passed down fruit, while the taller adults simply stretched and grabbed. A boy with a tired horse climbed onto its back to reach an especially red peach that called him. Before long, everyone's mouths were full of soft, sweet peach flesh and groans of delight. Even the peach vendor, his stand forgotten, stood under the tree with his eyes closed contently and peach juice dribbling out of his mouth. Min Li, however, didn't join in on the feast of peaches. "If I hadn't been eating peaches all the way to the city," Min Li said to herself, "I'd be the first one climbing the tree." But as she was slightly tired of peaches, Min Li saw what no one else did. She noticed that every time someone plucked a peach from the tree, a peach from the fruit stand disappeared. "The beggar is using the vendor's peaches for his tree." Min Li laughed to herself as she glanced at him through the fruit-eating crowd. He was watching with an amused look, and suddenly Min Li saw that the beggar wasn't really old at all. "He must be a magician. Maybe he can help me get into the inner city." Min Li edged toward him, and as she weaved her way to him, the last peach was picked from the tree, and the leaves and the branches began to disappear. The tree trunk seemed to shrivel into itself and grow thinner and shorter, and the crowd had finished their peaches, and the ground was littered with peach pits. When Min Li finally reached the beggar, the tiny twig of the tree vanished underneath the pile of peach pits, and the beggar was turning to leave. "Wait," Min Li said, and grabbed his arm. However, as Min Li took a hold of his sleeve, it pulled back, and a glint of gold shone. Hastily, the beggar pushed back his sleeve, but the quick glance was enough for Min Li to see that he wore a gold bracelet in the shape of a dragon. They stared at each other as Min Li's quick-thinking mind somersaulted. Only the imperial family is allowed to use the image of a dragon, Dragon had said. Everyone knows a golden dragon is always and only worn by kings, the buffalo boy had said. The words flashed in her mind, and Min Li could scarcely breathe. "You're wearing a dragon," Min Li gasped. "Only the is allowed to wear a golden dragon. You must be. Hey, where's that beggar?" A loud, angry shout cut through the chaos, and Min Li recognized the vendor's voice. "He stole my peaches! I'll get him!" And quickly, the beggar shook off Min Li from his arm and began to run. She stared in shock as she finished her sentence. "You must be the king." Here we are in chapter 22. Min Li shook herself from shock. "The king," Min Li said. "I can't lose him now." And in a panic, she began to run after the tattered figure. And it was quite a chase. Or it would have been if the beggar had realized that he was being followed. He wove in and out around people and bins of rice, each step taking him closer to the unused areas of the city. Behind a pile of discarded baskets, Min Li thought that she had lost him, but luckily the gray sleeve of his loose jacket waved at her, and she saw him round the walled corner of the inner city. As an abandoned wagon hid her from his view, she saw him push against a portion of the wall. With a slow groan, the wall moved. It was a secret door to the inner city, and Min Li was able to reach it just before it closed completely. With both hands, she pressed hard against it, and the door opened. And like a lid of a jewelry box, the door opened into a landscape of radiant colors. The bamboo, pine, and plum leaves seemed to shine in the sun as if carved from emeralds, and the accents of the pink and red flowers were like nestled rubies. Steps away from her, Min Li could see a patterned pathway made of water-worn pebbles. The central jade green lake mirrored the arching tiled roofs of the pavilions and the rough beauty of large weathered rock sculptures. A winding covered walkway lifted up from the cloudy water like a lotus flower. It could only be the palace garden. But Min Li barely noticed this. Instead, she stood with large eyes staring at the figure in front of her. The beggar was wiping his face with a delicate white cloth, and Min Li saw again that he was not an old man at all. In fact, he was younger than Ba. The gray of his hair was wiped away with the cloth as well, and his beard and head were as glossy black as Min Li's. His gray rags had been cast off in a pile next to him, and he was clothed in a bright yellow silk, the color of the sun. Intricate dragons and multicolored clouds that matched the designs of the gold bracelet that he wore were embroidered on his robes and glittered in the light. There was no doubt now that he was the king. Then the king turned around and saw her. At his glance, Min Li shrank to the ground with a humble kowtow. "Your Majesty," Min Li breathed, and her knees could feel the thumping of her heart in his chest. "Caught," Min Li heard him say, and she peeked up to see the king looking at her with the same amused expression he'd had as a beggar watching the people eat the peaches. He shook his head at her, with his eyes twinkling at her. He couldn't have been the young father of one of, or he could have been the young father of one of her village friends. And by you, he said, my little benefactor, I knew you were a clever one. Oh, your majesty, your majesty! A chorus of voices came through the air toward them, and Minli could see a parade of servants in the distance running across the zigzagged bridge. Well, you mustn't be caught by them, the king said to Minli. Then they would find out all about my little adventures, and then where will I be? And he pulled Minli up to her feet and pushed her behind one of the giant gnarled stone carvings, kicking his rags over her. Quickly, quickly, he said, and don't say a word. I command you not to say a word or to come out until I say so. Minli clutched the rough stone and made herself as small as possible. Hundreds of footsteps were approaching, like falling rain from a thunderstorm. What is this? The king demanded. Has war been declared on the city? Oh, your majesty, an out-of-breath voice said. We have been searching for you. Oh, searching for me? The king said. I have been here in the garden for hours. We must have missed you, the voice stuttered. None could find you, and the guards had not seen you, and we feared. You feared the king of the city of bright moonlight had been spirited away? The king laughed. Not this time, Counselor Chu. However, I do feel the wish to commune with the moon tonight. Your Majesty? The voice said. Yes, the king said decisively. Tonight I wish to be alone in the garden with the moon. Have a meal brought to me in the Clasping the Moon pavilion, and do not disturb me until morning. Yes, yes, your majesty, the voice said, and Minli couldn't help but peek out. She saw rows and rows of finely dressed people kneeling with their heads on the ground in front of the king. Their rich silk clothing shimmered in the fading sunlight. One man, dressed in black, kneeled closer to the king, separate from the rest of the courtiers. Minli guessed that was Counselor Chu. Actually, bring me 2 meals, the king said, and glanced toward Minli. She caught his eye and quickly shrank back out of sight. 2 meals, your majesty? Counselor Chu asked, with just the faintest question in his voice. Yes, 2 meals, the king said. I shall honor the spirit of the moon with her own meal, since she will be keeping me company. It's only fair. Yes, your majesty, the counselor said, and Minli could only guess how puzzled he was, but he was well trained enough to keep it out of his voice. In an hour's time, the king said, I shall be at the Clasping the Moon pavilion. I want the food waiting for me and nothing else. I do not wish to be disturbed by anyone this evening. Yes, your majesty, the voice said again, and Minli could hear the shuffling and the swishing of silk as the group rose and took their leave of the king. They've gone, the king said in a low voice. You can come out now. Minli crawled out from behind the sculpture. Well, my little friend, he said to her, now that you know who I am, walk with me and tell me who you are. And that's our reading for today. See you later.